Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving straight into a question that's literally puzzled humanity for centuries: the religious experience and what it means for theistic belief. Can a deeply personal spiritual encounter actually serve as a rational justification for believing in God? Well, we are going to explore the philosophical depths of Dr. Jim Spiegel's lecture on this exact monumental topic. Think of today's explainer as a bit of a detective's inquiry into this central question. You see, many people who believe in God do so not because of some abstract logical proof, but because of profound personal experiences. But in the strict realm of philosophy, does that actually hold up? Does an internal feeling carry objective weight? Let's find out. Here's our roadmap for today. We'll start by defining the experience, look at the causal argument, explore direct perception, test the evidence, and finally, tackle the skeptic's challenge. All right, Section 1, defining the experience. What exactly are we talking about here? Depending on how you define religion, an experience could be anything from a vague feeling of oneness with nature to a moment of deep self-realization. But religious studies scholar Rudolf Otto narrows it down to what he calls a numinous experience. This isn't just an emotion. It's defined as a direct apprehension of a personal being, someone with consciousness and moral qualities who is holy, awesome, and upon whom the subject depends for their very existence. What's absolutely crucial to grasp here is the firm insistence that this being is entirely separate from the person having the experience. We aren't talking about some psychological trick of self-reflection or tapping into your own subconscious. The claim here is a genuine encounter with a distinct external entity. Moving right along to Section 2, the causal argument. Let's look at effects and causes. I'm sure you've heard the stories, right? Someone converts to a religion and undergoes a massive, dramatic transformation. They give up destructive vices and suddenly start living a highly virtuous, healthy life. The crucial philosophical point here is reasoning backward from that highly visible effect to an ultimate divine cause. This argument claims that the radical life transformation is the effect, and God is the cause. But, of course, there are two sides to this coin. A skeptic naturally argues that you can explain these life changes through purely psychological or sociological factors. Maybe they changed because of peer pressure from new religious friends or just the psychological impact of adopting strict new moral duties. But philosopher J.P. Moreland counters this. He argues that while sociology and psychology definitely play a role, they fail to explain everything. He notes that when you look at William James's famous studies, you see these massive transformations happening across a huge variety of socioeconomic, cultural, and psychological contexts. Moreland argues that this vast variety makes a purely naturalistic explanation way less plausible, pointing instead towards something supernatural. That brings us to Section 3, the direct perception argument, or spiritual sensing. Now we're getting into a major breakthrough in this philosophical space. It draws a direct analogy between how we perceive physical objects and how someone might spiritually perceive God. This was heavily developed by William Alston, a leading figure in Christian epistemology in his book Perceiving God. Alston basically argues that we might actually have solid, rational grounds for claiming a direct, experiential awareness of God. And this relies on Alston's core concept, which he calls epistemic parity. It's a fancy term, but the idea is pretty straightforward. If sensory perception, like looking across the room and seeing a physical chair, is a reliable way to form beliefs, then mystical or numinous perception might be just as reliable. He claims the underlying structure of both experiences is remarkably similar. To back this up, Alston maps out 5 features that apply to both seeing a physical object and experiencing a spiritual reality. First, the subject needs to be capable, awake, eyes open, or spiritually willing. Second, the object has to exist independently of the perceiver. Third, there are public and private aspects. We can all look at the same chair, but we see it from our own unique angles. Fourth is the part-whole distinction. And fifth, there are public tests to verify the experience. Let's actually zoom in on that fourth point, because it's fascinating. Think about it. When you look at a chair, you only see the front of it, right? You don't see the inside of the wood, but you are still genuinely perceiving the chair. Dr. Spiegel uses a fascinating narrative from the Pentateuch to illustrate this in a mystical sense. Moses asks to see God, but is told an exhaustive view of an infinite being would destroy a mortal. So God says, "I'll show you my backward parts." Moses only safely glimpses a tiny fraction of God, yet it's still considered a genuine direct encounter. You don't need to perceive the entirety of something to perceive it authentically. Okay, Section 4, testing the evidence. How do we run public checks on this?
Look, we've all thought we spotted a deer on the highway only to check with the person in the passenger seat to confirm. Can we do that with mystical perception? Well, Alston and Moreland propose public tests for religious experiences. It starts with logical consistency. If you genuinely see a physical object, it can't be a round square. Similarly, a mystical experience can't be logically contradictory. You can't claim to experience a God who is simultaneously entirely personal and entirely impersonal.
Beyond just basic logic, these tests demand that a genuine experience should actually produce good moral consequences. A person should become more honest, sincere, and virtuous. Plus, the experience should mirror historical exemplars, meaning it needs to look somewhat similar to the encounters recorded by historical figures.
Take this quote from the prophet Isaiah, which perfectly highlights that similarity to exemplars test. When you read historical accounts from figures like Moses, Ezekiel, John, or Isaiah, a hallmark of a genuine direct encounter isn't exactly a casual high five with the divine. It's an extreme humbling. They fall down as though dead. I was disintegrating, I am undone. If a modern mystical perception is real, one might expect it to share some of that profound, humbling gravity, which leads us to our final section, objections and responses. Time to look at the skeptic's view. So, a prominent critic named Keith Augustine raises some serious red flags about Alston's parity argument. He points out a pretty massive disanalogy. We just lack publicly deployable methods to investigate these claims. I can predictably test physical perception by just walking back into a room to see if a chair is still there. But you simply can't control or reliably replicate unpredictable mystical encounters like that. Furthermore, Augustine points to the sheer diversity of completely incompatible mystical practices across global religions, arguing there are no independent reasons to trust one over the other. Dr. Spiegel's counter to this is that scriptures, or special revelation, actually do provide those opportunities for public investigation, giving us a robust framework to test the claims. But as you might guess, this pivots the debate. To address the fact that there are many competing religions with different experiences, Spiegel notes that the philosophical burden shifts over to the massive field of comparative religion. We essentially have to analytically assess which sacred texts, historically and otherwise, are actually reliable. And that brings us to the ultimate crossroads of this explainer. Personal religious experiences might actually offer a philosophically coherent, structured argument for theistic belief, grounded in direct perception and changed lives. But when faced with competing claims, that internal experience ultimately demands an external investigation. It leaves us with this profound question. When we look across the globe, which religious text, if any, holds the reliable revelation? I encourage you to keep exploring that question. Thanks for learning with me today.